10:40 on a Wednesday night, October 1973. Graham Hodges had been hacking out of Manhattan fleet garages for 2 years, part-time at first, on a 42% commission, then as a steady man keeping 49% of the day's receipts, plus tips. His cab that season was a Dodge Polara, fleet issued, and the street he was rolling down was West 45th, between Broadway and 8th Avenue, moving slowly, deliberately, with the meter off and the roof light on. The sidewalks were nearly empty. The marquees were lit above closed doors. To a passenger looking out the window, nothing was happening on West 45th Street at 10:40 on a Wednesday night. The driver knew otherwise. Behind those doors, roughly 1,000 people per theater were sitting in the dark, watching the second act end. Drivers who worked nights in Midtown in this era described the same learned fact. The theater district did not empty gradually. It emptied all at once. 5, 8, a dozen houses within a few minutes of each other, thousands of people stepping onto the same few blocks of sidewalk with their arms already rising. There was no dispatcher call for this. No radio crackled with an address. The demand had not happened yet, and yet the experienced night driver was already in position for it, the way a fisherman is in position before the tide turns. He had not guessed. He knew the timetable. The New York City taxi system in 1973 had a fixed fleet, a fixed fare, a fixed medallion count, and a regulatory commission barely 2 years old. None of it, not one line of it, told a driver to be on West 45th Street at 10:40 on a Wednesday. So the first question is not about the crowd, and not about the cab. It's about the timetable in the driver's head. Where did it come from? And what, exactly, was written in it? The cab most likely to be waiting on that block was a Checker, the A11, the taxi fleet version of the Marathon, built in Kalamazoo, Michigan, and by the 1970s the default New York cab in the eyes of everyone who had ever watched the city on a movie screen. It looked like a 1950s car, because it essentially was one. The body barely changed for 2 decades, which was the point. Unchanged styling meant cheap parts. Bolt-on rear quarter panels meant fast collision repair, and a flat rear floor the size of a small room meant 6 theatergoers in evening clothes could physically fit inside. Jump seats folded down, knees almost level, a rolling parlor. The system around that car was equally fixed. Since the Haas Act of 1937, the number of medallion cabs in New York had been capped, settling at 11,787 licenses. A number that did not move for decades, while the city around it did. Since 1967, every medallion cab was yellow by law, and most carried a bullet-resistant partition, mandated the same year. Since March 1971, the whole apparatus answered to a new agency, the Taxi and Limousine Commission, and the fare was fixed to the penny. After the 1971 increase, 60 cents on the drop, 10 cents each additional fifth of a mile, 10 cents per 72 seconds of waiting time. An average Manhattan ride ran about $2.50. Before we go further, if this kind of documentation matters to you, consider subscribing. Every video here goes into one specific aspect of American cab culture: the vehicle, the shift, the medallion, the dispatch, and the specific knowledge of the driver who knew their city in a way that no app has replicated. An experienced night driver carried the performance schedule of an entire entertainment district in his head, a timetable no meter recorded and no dispatcher broadcast, rebuilt from scratch every season. And if you drove a cab in this era, or your family did, leave it in the comments. If you drove nights in Manhattan in the 60s or 70s, where did you sit at 10:30, and how did you learn the curtain times? The hotel doorman, the whistle, and the dollar handshake. The other half of Midtown's night taxi economy is a story for a future video. Back to the cab. Fixed fleet. Fixed fare. Fixed color. The system regulated everything except the one decision that determined a night driver's entire income: where to be and when. That decision belonged to no rulebook. It belonged to the man behind the wheel, and in the theater district, it had a deadline accurate to the minute. What was written in the driver's timetable was not one number. It was a matrix. The baseline was the curtain. For most of this era, Broadway evening performances rose at 8:30, and in the early 1970s, in a period when Midtown's reputation after dark was collapsing, the theaters experimented with earlier curtains, around 7:30, precisely so audiences could be home sooner. A driver who missed that industry-wide adjustment by one season was sitting on the right block at the wrong hour, watching taillights. But curtain time was only the opening entry. The real knowledge was running times. A driver who worked these blocks learned, show by show, when each house actually broke. The 2-hour comedy at the booth let out before the 3-hour musical at the Majestic. Wednesday and Saturday had matinees, a second, smaller version of the surge in the middle of the afternoon. Monday, many theaters went dark, and the block that had been a gold seam on Tuesday was a dead zone. When a show closed and a new one opened, the entry had to be rewritten. Drivers who worked nights in this district in this era described the knowledge in exactly these terms. Not the theaters let out around 11, but this door, this many minutes, this side of the street. Layered under it was geography. The district ran roughly from 40th to 54th Street, packed between 6th and 8th Avenues, and nearly every street was one way. A cab positioned on the wrong side of a westbound street watched the crowd surge toward doors it could not legally reach. The knowledgeable driver did not park at the theater. He timed a slow loop, 8th Avenue up, the cross street east, so that his cab arrived at the doors in motion, empty, roof light lit. At the exact minute, the first wave hit the sidewalk. None of this was taught. The hack license test asked about streets, not curtains. So the timetable was built the only way it could be. Night after night, season after season, error by error. And then, at 11 o'clock, the doors opened, and the timetable met its event. It began as light. The lobby doors swung open, and a wedge of chandelier glow fell across the dark sidewalk. And then the sidewalk was gone, buried under people. 1,000 from one house, 1,000 more from the house next door. Within perhaps 10 minutes, across a dozen blocks, the theater district put more pedestrians on the pavement than some American downtowns held at noon. And a remarkable share of them wanted the same object, a yellow car with a lit roof light. Drivers who worked this hour described the sequence with the precision of people describing a tide they'd fished for years. The first arms went up before the crowd reached the curb. Theatergoers hailing over each other's heads, from between parked cars, stepping into the roadway itself. A cab that arrived lit and empty was claimed in seconds. The door slammed, the flag came down, 60 cents on the meter, and the destination was almost always short. A hotel on 6th, a restaurant on 52nd, an apartment in the East 60s. 10 minutes, $1 and change plus tip, and the driver was empty again, 2 blocks from the next theater that was just now breaking. This was the arithmetic that made the hour famous among night drivers. Not one big fare, but a chain of small ones, each with a fresh 60-cent drop, stacked back to back in the densest fare territory in North America. A driver who worked the let-out well could complete several fares within the hour, each one beginning where the last one ended, the district feeding him passengers faster than the meter could count them. But the same arithmetic had a second column. Every passenger loaded was a cab subtracted from the street, and the street was where 2,000 more people were still standing, arms up, watching the roof lights go dark one by one as block by block the supply ran out. Which raises the obvious question, the one every stranded theatergoer asked out loud into the night air. Where are all the cabs? The answer was not on the street. It was written in a law from 1937. Before you can understand why 1,000 people stood in the rain on West 45th Street, unable to buy a 10-minute ride, you need to understand what a law signed in 1937 meant for a Wednesday night in 1973. The Haas Act, signed by Mayor LaGuardia during the Depression, was a response to the opposite problem: too many cabs. 30,000 desperate men had flooded the streets. Fares collapsed, and the city froze the number of taxi licenses. the medallions, at the fleet then operating. The number settled at 11,787. And there, with the city growing, shrinking, and transforming around it, the number stayed. Through the post-war boom, through the 1960s, through this Wednesday night, that fixed number had made the medallion itself an asset. Issued at $10, it traded around $5,000 by 1950, and roughly $28,000 for an individual medallion by 1970. The price of a house, attached to the hood of a cab. Owner-drivers were, in Hodges' documented account of his own fleet years, a different class entirely from the men shaping up at the garage for a battered Dodge. But the cap had a second consequence, and the theater district exposed it nightly. A fixed fleet cannot surge. When demand spiked, every night at 11, and violently in rain, no additional supply existed to answer it. The fare was fixed, so price could not ration the crowd. The fleet was fixed, so quantity could not. The only variable left in the entire system was position. Which of the roughly 11,000 cabs, spread over 5 boroughs, happened to be inside a 12-block rectangle at the right minute? That is why the driver's timetable mattered. It was not a trick for a bigger tip. It was the single flexible element in an otherwise rigid machine. The only mechanism the 1937 law had left, without knowing it, for matching the city's supply to the city's want. The system did not manage the surge. The drivers who understood it did, which meant the surge was worth exactly what a driver could extract from it. So what did this hour actually pay? Start with the split. A fleet driver in the early 1970s did not keep the meter. Hodges' documented arrangement was typical. 42% of receipts as a part-timer, 49% as a steady man, plus tips, which were his alone. That last clause is the key to the whole hour. Run the numbers on the theater letout. 5 short fares in the hour after 11 at roughly $1.50 to $2 each on the meter was perhaps 8 or 9 metered dollars, of which the driver kept less than half. Modest, but every one of those 5 fares carried a tip, and theater passengers, dressed, celebrating, in company, slightly embarrassed to dig for exact change in front of a date, were documented tippers. 5 drops meant 5 tips. The same hour spent on one long fare meant 1. That was the calculation the district forced on every night. Man, the letout versus the airport. A Kennedy run paid more on the meter, but it was a lottery ticket followed by a long deadhead back, or a wait in the airport queue. The theater district was the opposite bet. Small, certain, repeating. Drivers who worked nights in this era described the choice in exactly those terms. The district was where you went when you wanted the night's bookkeeping settled by midnight, and there was a subtler entry in the ledger. The let-out crowd was, by the standards of a 1973 night shift, the safest hour of the night. Sober enough, moneyed, traveling in pairs, going to doorman buildings and hotel canopies. For a driver working behind a bullet-resistant partition in a city where the trade's dangers were statistical fact, an hour of theatergoers was not just income. It was an hour off the clock of worry. Which is the detail that turns the story inside out. Because the reason that hour felt like relief was the same reason the theaters had begun moving their curtains earlier. The district around the marquees was coming apart. What, exactly, was the theater crowd stepping out into? By the early 1970s, Times Square had become one of the most notorious stretches of urban America. The theater district's own historians describe it plainly as one of the grungiest and most dangerous neighborhoods in New York. The Broadway houses had not moved. The city around them had. Marquees now shared their blocks with grindhouses and sex shops. The crowd that emptied out of a musical at 11 stepped onto sidewalks, the same city was telling them, in every newspaper, to avoid after dark. The trade felt it before the audience did. Despite the partition mandate of 1967, 7 New York cab drivers were killed and 3,000 robbed in the first 9 months of 1970 alone. That is the statistical backdrop behind every choice in this video. Behind the partition glass, behind the driver's preference for the let-out crowd, and behind the theater's own scheduling experiments, moving curtains earlier so audiences could be out of the district sooner. And it explains something essential about the surge itself, why the arms went up so urgently. For the theatergoer of 1973, the cab was not one transport option among several. The subway at 11:30 meant lower frequency and a platform weight the era's headlines had taught them to dread. Walking east to quieter avenues meant crossing exactly the blocks they'd been warned about. The yellow door at the curb was something else entirely. A lit, licensed, metered piece of the ordinary city, available at the exact spot where the extraordinary city began. When a hand went up outside the Schubert, it was not hailing a car. It was hailing a boundary. Here is the insider's view of it. A driver who had worked these blocks for years knew the district the way a lighthouse keeper knows a coastline. A strip of intense light with dark water on every side, and his job was the crossing. He knew which side streets stayed peopled after the letout, and which went empty in minutes. He knew that the fare from the Majestic to the East 60s was really a fare from one island of light to another. The meter recorded distance. What the passenger was buying was passage. So what did those crossings look like from the back seat? And why did the whole scramble feel, to the people in it, like a second rush hour? From the back seat, the hour had its own etiquette and its own warfare. Multiple parties hailing the same approaching cab was not the exception at 11 o'clock. It was the standard condition. Documented complaints of the era read like weather reports. Couples drifting upstream, away from the theater doors, to intercept cabs a block early. Men stationing themselves at the corner where the one-way flow entered the block. The silent, citywide understanding that in rain, all etiquette was suspended. Rain was the multiplier. Demand rose as walking became miserable, while the cabs already loaded stayed loaded longer in slowed traffic. The nights the crowd most needed the fleet were precisely the nights the fleet had the least to give. What makes this hour historically interesting is not the scramble itself. It's what the scramble reveals about how the city kept time. New York's official rush hours were built on work. The morning surge in, the evening surge out. The pattern every transit planner drew first. But here was a third surge, fully predictable, repeating 6 nights a week for decades, that had nothing to do with work at all. It ran on curtain times. It was scheduled by producers and stage managers, not employers. The theater district's 11 o'clock was proof that a city's pulse is set by everything it does collectively at the same time, and that entertainment, done at Broadway's scale, was as real a piece of transportation infrastructure as any office tower. The official system never saw it. No fare rate acknowledged it. No TLC rule mentioned curtain times. The second rush hour existed in exactly one written form: the private timetables inside the heads of the night drivers who served it. Hundreds of separate, unshared, individually maintained copies of the same knowledge. Hundreds of copies, no master, which is why the question of what happened to that knowledge has a strange answer. It was never lost exactly. It was made unnecessary, all at once, by something that arrived carrying no knowledge at all. The machine went first. Checker built its last cab in Kalamazoo in July 1982, and the boxy silhouette thinned out of the district year by year. The last Checker licensed in New York, driven by owner-operator Earl Johnson since 1978, was retired by the TLC in July 1999, at a ceremony held, fittingly, in Times Square. The district itself was remade around the same time, scrubbed and redeveloped into the entertainment engine it is today. The knowledge went differently. When App Dispatch arrived, decades later, it did not learn the curtain times. It did not need to. It watched demand ignite on a map in real time, and priced and routed accordingly. Solving at 11 o'clock, every night, from nothing. The problem a night driver had once solved in advance, from memory. The result was genuinely better matching and genuinely worse mystery. The timetable that had taken seasons to build was replaced by a system that never knew the timetable existed. And yet, stand on West 45th Street at 11 tonight, and the surge is still there. The curtain still falls. The doors still open. the arms still rise. The demand outlived the fleet, the meter rate, the partition, and the men who knew its schedule by heart. If this channel is worth subscribing to, that's how you tell us. The experienced night driver held an entire district's rhythm in his head, unrecorded and unshared, the kind of urban knowledge that made a fixed system flexible, and that no algorithm inherited, because no algorithm needed to. And if you have a cab story from this era, as a driver, as a regular passenger, as someone whose city this was, write it in the comments. Did you ever work the letout, or stand in it in the rain with your arm up? Which city? Which decade? Which shift? Graham Hodges drove his last shift in 1975. 5 years of hacking out of Manhattan fleet garages. Bulk service, then for naught. 42%, then 49%. What the trip sheets showed: shifts completed, fares logged, commissions paid. What the trip sheets didn't show: what 1040 on West 45th Street meant on a Wednesday. Which house broke first? Which corner the one-way flow favored? What rain did to the arithmetic? That went with him, into, as it happened, a history book. The next driver who took that shift learned it the way he had learned it, by showing up, by reading the marquees, by doing it enough times.